loved a good court case. They were crazy about it. And they prided themselves on their justice system. In a world where you can be taken to trial for basically anything, and if you don't have the ability to argue your way out of a court case, you could potentially, horrible things could happen to you. You could lose everything you've ever worked for. You could be banished. In that world, people paid the sophists to teach them how to argue. They paid these experts in rhetoric to, at all costs, even if they were guilty, teach them to argue their way out of anything. Even if they had to resort to fallacies, the main point was winning the argument at all costs. And when Socrates came along and famously criticized the sophists for spreading around these cheap argument tactics, they answered back to him with the fact that, look, all we're really doing is teaching useful information. The thing is, they're absolutely right. If you live in a climate where fallacies win people over in an argument, then they're incredibly useful. Just not logically sound, right? And I guess this may be the difference between a lawyer finding use in the information and trying to make a philosophy podcast that might change a few people's minds. But you'd have to at least acknowledge, Mr. Lawyer, that the arguments that you use to persuade people change based on the setting that you're in. Right? Like, as a lawyer, in a certain situation where those fallacies would not be as useful, you might opt not to use them, right? Do a thought experiment. Let's imagine an alternative universe, one where I, Stephen West, supreme dictator of the world, Führer Westenhaven. Let's say I rounded up everybody, I put them in a room, I brainwashed them, I just played the How to Win an Argument episode, and I said, look, you're not leaving this table until you can recite these episodes word for word, and you can instantly spot the most common fallacies that people use in arguments. Well, in that world, in the same way you adjust your arguments in certain settings in this world, in the same way politicians change theirs given the current company, these fallacies that are so useful in today's world, they wouldn't affect people the same way. Here's the thing. At one point in my life, ad hominem attacks used to seem like knockdown arguments for me. You know, if I was that age in today's culture, I might see Donald Trump say to Ted Cruz, he thinks he's fit to manage the future of the U.S. economy? Coming from a guy that can't even manage his own finances? Oh yeah, I've heard about that failed business you had. The one that went down the toilet? Is that going to be the U.S. economy now? And I'd be like, yeah, you're right, Donald. You're right. Who are you to run the U.S. economy, Cruz? But by learning about logical fallacies and practicing a bit, at a certain point, I just got to the point, like, you know, if I saw that in today's world, I would just say, ad hominem, discrediting the source. Like a machine. Point is, that emotional response that was evoked back then isn't in me anymore, because I instantly identify it as what it is. So, in response to your question of who cares about any of this stuff, this is the reason why I would make that episode. The reason somebody would potentially disseminate that information, because hypothetically, if that episode exists and it's for free out there, you know, if you guys share these episodes with your friends and they share it with their friends, eventually, who knows? We might find ourselves living in a very different world come the next political debate season. By the way, I love that you bring up politics, my friend, because these are the key issues, right? These are the ideas that are potentially based on fallacies that might change the world as we know it. As we talked about last episode, any war, any hatred, any subjugation that we can study throughout history, really at its core, was brought about because of a belief. A belief that someone had about what the right thing to do was in a given situation. A belief that was based on an idea that was validated because of some sort of argument that was had, either internally or with someone else. Take a second and just look around you, all right? If you have a problem with the way that people are treating each other, at any level, if you have a problem with anyone marginalizing or killing each other, understand that ultimately what is at the root of that behavior that you have a problem with is a belief. And you can punch that person in the face, you can send a destroyer there and shoot cruise missiles at them from 1,000 miles away. You can waterboard them until your heart's content, but understand that if you have a problem with what you see as, you know, a sort of intellectual cockroach infestation, all you're doing there is taking a Louisville Slugger and smashing individual cockroaches. You're doing nothing to affect what's at the root of the problem, the nest, if you will, which is a belief. Throughout recorded history, there's only been one reliable way of changing beliefs, and that is by winning a war of ideas. Now, in this war of ideas, winning an argument is like winning a small battle. It's like a local militia holding off an invading force. Doesn't decide the war. But eventually, enough of these little battles start piling up. Eventually, they may turn the tides of the war. So again, in answer to your question of who cares about this stuff, if winning an argument is like winning a battle in this war of ideas, then knowing logical fallacies is like the artillery in the battle. It's like calling in an airstrike. It's intel. It's knowing the weaknesses in your enemy's defenses. By the way, it works the other way too. If you find yourself in an argument with somebody that sees ad hominem attacks as a totally reasonable and persuasive argument, talk about just adding firepower to your arsenal on that battlefield. But in reality, I'm telling you this, in my experience, most people are cool. Most people are reasonable about this stuff. Most people, when confronted with the fact that some belief that they hold is based on a fallacy, most of the time, if you're not militant about it, if you frame it in a positive way, in the interest of us both being passionate people that care about the world, that are trying to understand it better, most people aren't so stubborn that they wouldn't ever revise their beliefs about something. Usually what happens if they feel like they're backed into a corner is they say, okay, well, maybe that might not be logically sound, but how about this other fallacy that justifies what I believe? But eventually, with enough reasonable, respectful conversation, enough of these battles fought, most people are willing to change their beliefs if, in fact, they believe they're only based on fallacies. Because at the root of every argument that somebody makes about something is a sort of mathematical equation. This is something Aristotle realized all the way back in 300 BC. You know, it seems that an argument, when you break it down, has a certain formula to it. Now, in the most general sense, an argument is when you have certain premises that you lay out, and these are cited as reasons or evidence to justify a conclusion that you have. Premises, conclusion. Some arguments are premise, conclusion. Some arguments are premise, therefore premise, conclusion, etc. So Aristotle sat down and tried to identify these arguments using mathematical variables. First one to use the mathematical variable, by the way. And it went well. He ended up finding a lot of these. He wrote down what he thought was every, quote, equation that could be considered a viable argument. If the argument didn't fit that syntax, then it had to be in some way logically unsound to Aristotle. It's weird to think about these things in such mathematical terms. You know, it's weird to think about something like arguing. It's typically seen as such an emotional thing in such logical terms. Actually, another email that I got this week a lot. You know, when I argue from the gut. I feel it in my gut. There's no X, Y, and Z in my gut. But what is that gut? There's no magic gut that you're pulling arguments from. That gut is an emotional response that's based on the feeling that you initially get, which is based on all your previous experiences and all the analysis that you've done up until that point in your life. So in a metaphorical sense, we really do argue by throwing equations at each other. You may say 1 + 1 = 2. They say, yeah, 1 + 1 = 2, but 2 + 3 = 6. So therefore, 1 + 1 + 2 + 3 must equal 8. Being able to spot logical fallacies is being able to see instantly that the mistake that they made in their thinking was that 2 + 3 = 6. Being able to hone in on it real quick. And what a great skill to have if you're trying to quickly cut through all the stuff that typically clouds an argument, you know? Rhetoric, condescension, where you're having the conversation, when you're having the conversation, the people standing around, cultural prejudices. By the way, here's another answer to that question of who cares about this stuff. Identifying these fallacies is not just useful when it comes to winning an argument against your grandma at Christmas dinner. When you're able to instantly spot these logical fallacies, it's funny. The percentage chance of you being swindled by someone or joining a cult goes down quite substantially. Like, knowing logical fallacies is like an iron dome around your bank account. There's never been a single person in the history of the world that has known logical fallacies that has drunk poisonous Kool-Aid. It's never happened. The reason is that these people that peddle this nonsense rely on you glossing over their terrible arguments. It's the way they make their money. What I'm saying is, this is not just an offensive skill set, it's a defensive one as well. That said, thanks for sending the emails this week. Fantastic questions. I mean, to be honest with you, if I had questions like this every week, I could do 2 episodes of this podcast a week. I could do one that's just new content, and the other one that's responding and clarifying the questions to that content. It's easy for me. It's like talking into a microphone. But before we run out of time, Let's talk about some more of these logical fallacies. What do you say? The first one I want to talk about is an extremely common one. It's called the red herring fallacy. Boy, is it one of my favorites. It takes so many different forms. Typically, a red herring fallacy is when somebody, in the middle of an argument, changes the subject to something else that's only tangentially related to avoid having the original argument and change it to something that they might stand a better chance at arguing. Now, real quick, as you can imagine, you should look out for this one, particularly when you're winning an argument. Usually somebody will launch all their arguments at you, pew, 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 and then you point out the problems in their way of thinking instead of conceding defeat. Surrender their sword to the opposing general. They'll just change the subject entirely, so now it's a new battlefield you're fighting on. For example, let's say you're talking to somebody who believes a teapot is orbiting between Mercury and Venus, right? And you say, it seems that you believe that there's a teapot orbiting around the sun between the planets of Mercury and Venus, but it seems like all the arguments you've given me for why that's the case don't hold any water. You might say back, yeah. It's kind of like when I was at the store the other day buying tea, and this guy came up, and he could clearly see that I was looking at the last box of black tea, and he took it anyway. Why are people so inconsiderate in this world? Don't you agree? Wait a second. That's not what we were talking about. Be careful. That's just an example. Red herrings aren't always this obvious in a conversation. For example, you might ask somebody, why haven't you given a single raise or a single day off to your employees in over a decade? Spokesperson of the company might say, well, you know what, at this company, we try to focus 100% of our efforts on providing a good product and customer experience. We believe in a world where the customer comes first. I haven't answered the question. Another tactic people commonly use is they use another fallacy altogether as a red herring. Oh, that's a master class in fallacies. We're going to watch out for that. Let's say they're using an ad hominem. You may say, so in conclusion, it seems like this new tax proposed by the mayor to reduce crime in the area is going to really help. You might respond, right, the mayor being the guy arrested for a DUI 5 years ago? Yeah, he knows a ton about how to stop crime, right? He was probably drunk when he wrote that tax proposal. How can we know he wasn't? Another common fallacy that we see everywhere in our society is called the argument from authority fallacy. The way I like to think of this one is that it's kind of the opposite of an ad hominem. Instead of saying that an argument is invalid because of the terrible, uncredible source that it's coming out of, this one uses a source, props it up, and says that this thing has to be true because it's coming out of this source. The problem with this way of thinking is that one constant in the universe is human error. Right? People make mistakes. No matter how great a source may be most of the time, it's not going to be perfect, and it's downright illogical to assume that solely because something came from a source that's usually good, that it has to be true. We see examples of this argument